Good morning and welcome to the 2013 Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. Today, the Royal Tyrrell Museum and its cooperating society are proud to present Mr. Darren Tanke. Darren is a preparation technician here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum, and he has worked here for 33 years. Darren is originally from Calgary. He first started working in the Palaeontology department of the Provincial Museum of Alberta in 1979. Originally as a volunteer. Then Darren moved to Drumheller during the early phase of the development of the Royal Tyrrell Museum to work as a preparation technician, and he has been here ever since. Darren's research interests focus on dinosaur paleontology and dinosaur pathologies. He's also a leader of the Mystery Quarry Project, which aims at relocating lost dinosaur quarries from the first half of the 20th century. Darren has conducted field work in numerous countries, including Canada, the United States, China, Argentina, Australia, Mongolia, England, France, and Norway. Today, Darren will discuss how Alberta dinosaurs ended up at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in a talk entitled Dinosaurs in the Deep, the 1916 sinking of the SS Mount Temple and her dinosaur cargo. So, without further delay, I present to you Mr. Darren Tanke.
Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me back there okay? Perfect. Okay. Well, thanks for coming. This is a project I've been working on for over 10 years now. I first learned about this ship and its cargo when I was about 10 years old. I read about it in a book, and little did I know, about 30 years later, I'd become the world's leading authority on the topic. It's the kind of project a historian just dreams about. The old literature just talks about the ship being sunk with 2 dinosaurs on board by a torpedo, and that's basically all it says in dinosaur books. And if you look in nautical history literature, it talks about the ship being sunk by a surface raider. And the story and the little side histories are just an amazing project that I'll share with you today over the next hour. The talk can be controversial to some people. I've actually had shouting and a boycott because of people of German descent being upset that I'm telling this story. I have nothing against Germans, and war is a pretty nasty business, and I'm only reporting what happened here. I'm not making any judgments against German people. So this is the story of 2 ships, the SS Mount Temple on the bottom, a Canadian Pacific passenger and transport ship, and the SMS Möwe, or German for seagull, on the top. And these 2 ships had a fateful encounter in the mid-North Atlantic in early December 1916. Now, Mike talked to you about mystery quarries. Now, a mystery quarry led to this whole story I'm about to tell you about today. Mystery quarries are sites that we find in the badlands where someone has been digging there. We can see a hole in the side of the hill, but there's no way to know who was there, when, or what was collected. So we can use things like garbage and newspaper bits, and we can use that to date the vintage of the quarry. And if there's some bones left behind, we can tell what kind of animal came out of there. And using old field photographs, we can tie all of this information together, and I'll show you an example. And also no quarry stake, which is a marker which is put in the site. So I gave a talk on mystery quarries in Dinosaur Park in the summer of 2001, and in the audience were 2 Norwegian students. And you're going to see there's a very strong Norwegian tie to this whole story. But just remember these 2 Norwegian students. They sat and listened to my talk, and here they are. We've got Nikolai on the left and Tom on the right. They paid attention because we're out in the Badlands about a week later, and one of them comes running down the hill shouting, "We found garbage!" So it's like, okay. So I went and looked at it, and they took me to the site you see on the bottom. And it was a new site to me, but I knew I'd seen it before, but I wasn't sure why or where. And then it realized a couple weeks later, It's in Sternberg's book, Hunting Dinosaurs, North Deer River, and there's the same quarry there in 1917. And in Sternberg's book, the figure caption says, from this quarry, one of the Mount Temple dinosaurs was collected. So that meant that this dinosaur that we see here being collected is now on the bottom of the North Atlantic. That was all fine and good, except for one thing. History said 2 dinosaurs were sunk, and we knew where those quarries were already. The Norwegians had found a 3rd site. So I started to try to figure out what this 3rd animal was, and this led to the story I'm about to tell you today. So this was quite exciting. So we know that that specimen was collected in 1916 by Charles H. Sternberg and his son Levi. There was, as you all know, when the Americans came to Alberta starting in 1910 and were taking all the dinosaurs away from Alberta and taking them back to New York, there was a lot of public outcry about this. So the Canadian government hired the Sternberg family, and they collected in competition with the American Museum. The American Museum finished their work here in 1915, so there was less need for the Sternbergs to be working in Alberta. And then, unfortunately, the Canadian Houses of Parliament burned to the ground, and the Sternbergs' laboratory, everything was shoved off to one side, and politicians were doing their stuff in there. And then when Sternberg asked, well, what about the 1916 field season? They said, well, there's a war on, we don't have a lot of money, and there's no field season this year. So Sternberg left, and that broke apart the Sternberg family, which worked together for decades. So Charles H. and his son Levi got a contract to work with the British Museum of Natural History in London, and the plan was for them to collect enough dinosaurs to build an exhibit that would be on par with the Alberta dinosaur exhibits then on display in Ottawa and in New York City. It's poorly documented. There's no field notes that we've been able to find. There are some letters that Sternberg wrote to his bosses back in London every couple of weeks. And there's photographs which have been scattered all over the place. And we can actually pull them together too, which I'll show you here shortly. So we can reconstruct what happened in the summer of 1916. So we can see here quarry 17 and 18 are the known sites where the dinosaur was on the Mount Temple, and the new site the Norwegians found in the upper right is the one they got. Now, one thing that's interesting in Dinosaur Park, I have what I call the cluster effect, where we can demonstrate that certain collectors had a certain way of doing things. Some collectors would go all over the park and collect, and others would just stay in one area. And we can see the cluster effect here where we've got quarries close together. We've got 3 now that we know that are in a very tight area. And we've got another mystery quarry, number 10, and kind of it's guilty by association. It might be 1916, we're not sure. So we'll talk about some of the human artifacts found on the site, and these are important for dating purposes. Now, we found a rock cairn, and it didn't make a lot of sense why they'd have a rock cairn in 1916. Prior to that, if one of the crews found a dinosaur they wanted to collect, they would put a big pile of rocks on it. And that would signal to the other museum, we've been here, this is our dinosaur, we're going to come and get it later, go away. But when we went to the site, we realized you can't see the site from above or below. So we think that this rock cairn was actually, probably had some bright rag tied to it, just so they could see where the site was. We found some planks which told us that they were building crates on site. And that's something we don't do today, but back then they would actually make the plaster jacket, build the crate, stuff it full of grass, nail it shut, slide the crate down the hill, and put it in a wagon, and it was ready to take back to camp. So we know there was crates being built. We found this piece of glass, which was very thin. It didn't make any sense to us as from a lantern or from a door. Someone thought, okay, maybe it was from a door, but everything was new. in that part of Alberta back then. People were moving into Alberta and setting up their farmsteads. And then I realized that this is probably a glass plate negative. They took a picture, took the negative out of the camera, and it fell on the ground, and they just left the glass behind. So we took some old pictures that were taken from that time period, and it actually does work out there. It is a glass plate negative. Now, what I'm doing here, Sternberg has already told us it is a 1916 quarry, but I'm trying to just confirm it with the evidence that we have on hand that it truly is a 1916 quarry, not a 1914 quarry, because Sternberg sometimes made errors in the things he wrote. We found plaster on site, which you would expect is a dinosaur quarry. We found burlap with an open weave, which is more typical of an old quarry versus the more modern quarries, which have a tighter weave. And we found newspaper. Now, in my talk to the Norwegians, I talked about how we solved a quarry from 1927 as being from the Royal Ontario Museum because we found an ad talking about Yonge Street, which I think most of us in here know is a very famous street in Toronto. Well, they found this newspaper, and we got down on our hands and knees, and I looked really close, and you can see Yonge. So there's an address for Yonge Street. And the Norwegians saw that, and they both fell to their knees and just bowed to me because they remembered that I talked about it in the talk earlier, and now it had happened yet again. But what was really cool, not only we solved, and we know that it is 1916 newspaper, it caused a bit of a conundrum because in 1916, the Sternbergs lived in Ottawa. You would expect an Ottawa newspaper or a Calgary newspaper, but it was a Toronto newspaper. So I looked into this, and it turns out Levi's fiancée lived in Toronto. And she was probably forwarding his mail and some newspapers, which was destined to end up in the dinosaur quarry. We know that newspaper is what we see in that arrow right there. That's exactly the spot where we found the newspaper. They put the newspaper on the ground, probably put a rock on it, walked away, and then every time it rained, water and sand and clay would get between all the pages. They stuck it to the ground, stuck all the pages together. It could not blow away. Now, this photo was found in England with absolutely no information on it. And the only information that I can see in the photograph is number 1. Well, that's jacket number 1, and he's probably working on jacket number 2. But I was able to associate this photograph with the one in Sternberg's book. Actually, if we just go back a bit, the jacket in the upper right has kind of a pork chop shaped to it, and the jacket he's working on is still on its pedestal of rock, sitting horizontal in the ground. When we go back to the photograph, you can see the same pork chop shaped jacket there, and there's the jacket the man was working on in the previous photograph. Other photographs that we found show this tibia and fibula, which is expanded at one end because the bones came apart as the skeleton rotted. If I was going to collect that in the field, I would make a long triangular shaped jacket, narrow on one end and wide on the other, and there is a jacket exactly the same shape right there. So I think that we can associate these two pictures together and the one previous. So it is possible, by looking for commonality of subject matter, to reassociate pictures that have become widely scattered over a long period of time. Alone, these pictures are interesting, but don't tell us a lot, but when you're able to pull them together, they tell us a much bigger story about what's going on. So what was lost? The Sternberg book tells us that 2 hadrosaurs were lost. The Norwegians have found a 3rd specimen. So how do we figure out what was lost? So I went through all of the letters. I went through all of the notes and paperwork they had in England. And I found this list right here. And it seems to indicate only two specimens there. One with a skull. So that jibes with the historical accounts. but does not jibe with the site the Norwegians found. So I looked into this a bit more, and we realized that the animal in that skeleton that we were looking at, the bones in the previous slides, was actually the first specimen ever of an animal called Parasaurolophus. A very rare duck-billed dinosaur. There's only one skeleton with a skull known from Alberta and two possible skeletons without a skull known from Alberta. So that was lost on board. Now, how do we know it was Parasaurolophus? The bone that's arrowed there is called the pubis. It's right in the groin region. And the blade on the pubis in different duck-billed dinosaurs right there has a different shape. So I sent this photograph off to a guy at the Smithsonian who's the kind of the duck-billed dinosaur guru, and he got all excited because he thought we were uncovering this now. And he's like, "You got Parasaurolophus. Tell me all about it." So I did. I told him all about the 1916 sinking, and he's like, "Oh." So a Parasaurolophus probably in that quarry and now lost. Sternberg in his letters also talks about a specimen of Prosaurolophus, but the specimen that's going to come to the British Museum is even better. So we have a Prosaurolophus here that's in our galleries for illustrative purposes. So one of these is on the bottom. He talks also about many bones of a skeleton of a Champsosaur. These are very common as isolated bones in Dinosaur Provincial Park, but as a skeleton, they're not that common. In fact, I don't think we have many good ones in our museum. So that's a pretty big loss. He talks about this odd turtle where the ribs are not coossified with the margin, resembles somewhat sea tortoises of the Niobrara chalk of Kansas. I talked to several turtle researchers about this, and the description, while short, describes what we call a macrobaenid turtle. This is an animal now called Judithemys, and it's kind of ironic that this turtle was lost on board because some researchers believe that these types of turtles gave rise to modern sea turtles. So you could say that he is now with his descendants at the bottom of the ocean. He talks about a Boremys shell. These are quite common, so it's not as big a loss. Oh, I should also say, when I sent this description to another researcher in the States, and he thought we had another new macrobaenid shell as well, but then I have to tell him also the story about the Mount Temple sinking. So he says, you know, it's actually a good thing it was sunk because he's now the expert on these types of turtles. He says if the ship had never been sunk, the turtle would have been recognized as unique and would have already been described, and I would have ended up working on something totally different. So it worked out for him. So Boremys, there were some Boremys shells on there, a very common type of turtle, not as big a loss. Soft shell turtle shell was on board as well, quite common. But here's where it gets interesting. Sternberg's letters talk about, you know, I'm making a clean sweep. You'll get thousands of good bones. You'll get everything we collect. We've got hundreds of bones already collected and many more located. When I went to the British Museum in 2005 to look for these, I found 12. So where are the rest? So I asked the British Museum, did you discard any of that collection? They had no record of that. Did you sell any of that collection? They had no record of that. Did you trade any of that collection with other museums? They had no record of that. So all of this stuff is now on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So here's a list. The very last letters talk about another unidentified hadrosaur skull. I don't know if it was collected or not. And they describe a horned dinosaur skull so completely that it had to have been completely uncovered in 1916. But I can't find a skull that matches it in any museum anywhere in the world. So I think that this skull is also on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So a huge loss. So now we're going to talk about the Mount Temple itself and how she came to be in this situation. The Mount Temple, I don't know if many of you have heard of the ship, but she's actually quite famous for a number of reasons. She was a cargo ship at first, but she also was a passenger liner. And for the Canadian Pacific Lines, she made over 30 transits back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, bringing back thousands of European immigrants. So there's a chance our ancestors were on this ship between about 1912 and 1916. She's also famous for running aground off Nova Scotia. Now, I still have not found any account why this happened, but in a blinding snowstorm, the ship became 80 miles off course and crashed onto the rocks off an island off Nova Scotia with a whole bunch of Eastern European immigrants who spoke no English, who knew they were all about to die. So it was a lot of panic. So the crew was able to get some rockets that fired ropes to the shoreline, and they were able to tie the ropes off to a tree. And then 2 people at a time in a wicker basket, they lowered the people from the ship to the island where they all huddled in the cold, knowing they weren't going to drown, but now they were going to freeze to death. And eventually someone was able to find people to help them, and they were able to get them all sheltered. But the ship was stuck there for months and months and months. And I guess they didn't have security guards back then. So while the ship was left unguarded, the people of Nova Scotia in that area climbed on board and basically ransacked the ship. And apparently you can go to antique shops in Nova Scotia today and find Chinaware with the Mount Temple crest on it. Something else they stole were potatoes. There was hundreds of tons of potatoes on board. The people took them and ate them, but kept some of them to grow for the next year, and the next year, and the next year. So it is possible in this part of Nova Scotia today to find potatoes called Mount Temples. The Mount Temple is also very famous as part of the Titanic sinking. She's often accused of being the ship that just sailed away, but the Titanic gave the wrong coordinates. The Titanic said they were right there. So the Mount Temple steamed over to that spot, but the Titanic was actually over there. So the Mount Temple was unable to render assistance. But if you Google Mount Temple and Titanic, hundreds and hundreds of hits you'll get. And the captain of the Mount Temple is actually hauled before a board of inquiry to defend himself why his ship just sailed away, and is like, dude, I wasn't there. Wasn't there. She's also now famous for the sinking with the dinosaurs on board. So now we need to find out, I'm going to give you a little short course here on the history of German naval strategy of World War I. Now, when the war started, Germany had a modern but small fleet of surface ships and submarines. Her submarines were very modern but very small and could not carry a lot of torpedoes, which you need to sink ships. So what they would do is they would surface next to you, declare their intentions to sink you, order you to stop, allow you to get into your lifeboats and take all your food and whatever you needed to take, and then they would sink your ship with the deck gun, submerge, and be on their way. And you'd have to row to a safe port if you made it. So the people had a chance. The people on the victim ships at least had a chance to survive. But the Admiralty did not like this. You know, the Germans are sinking British ships or allies of the British Commonwealth. So what the British did is they created ships that looked like a helpless duck in the water, but actually were armed to the teeth. And they would wait for a German submarine to surface next to them, declare their intentions to sink you. They'd actually have people running around in a panic, getting in lifeboats. And while all that was going on, they had guns that were hidden on the ship. And they'd swing those out and blast the German submarine and sink it. Of course, the Germans don't like that. So you can just see this war it's escalating. So the Germans began to sink ships and ask questions later. And what ended up happening is the Lusitania got sunk. 1,200 lives lost, including about 100 Americans. And this was kind of the spark that got America involved in World War I. It caused a huge outcry worldwide. I mean, helpless, innocent people were killed, and Germany had to really rethink its naval strategy. What was it going to do? It's trying to sink all these ships coming to England. England is a small country, doesn't have a lot of resources, it has a lot of people. If you can sink all the ships coming to England loaded with food and supplies, you can let England wither on the vine and she'll eventually have to surrender. That was the idea. And it almost worked up until about 1917, and then the Allies got smart and they started to convoy their ships all together instead of letting them be here, there, and everywhere. They brought them all together. Now, also, when the war was declared, Germany had bases all around the world. She was also a colonial power. She had bases around the world, and so did the British. So the British and German ships would do battle, but because the British ships were bigger, had bigger guns that could fire further distances, and they had more ships, the British, in a war of attrition, would ultimately win. So Germany systematically had her fleet sunk. So what were they going to do? So the Germans realized they had some obsolete battleships that had whacking big guns on them that still fired big shells, and those guns would be useful on other kinds of ships. So what they did is they mounted big guns on passenger liners. And the British did this as well. Now, a ship that big, they're very fast. You can't catch them, but they need a lot of coal, and the British have blockaded all the German ports all around the world. So where are the Germans going to get coal from? They have to go back to Germany. Well, the ship's waiting for them there too. And eventually, Germany lost all of her passenger liners. She's creating what we call a surface raider. And of course, the British did this too. And there was actually this famous battle where two passenger liners were slugging it out in the Atlantic Ocean. These ships are not designed for warfare. They have thin hulls, and one shot below the waterline is all it would take to sink you. They sent out this ship. This ship actually did quite well. 14 ships captured or sunk by this sailing ship. So then what Germany did is they took all of their, or some of their freighters, and put guns on them, which were all hidden behind folding steel plates. And it was agreed upon during the Napoleonic Wars that you could fly the flag of a neutral or friendly country and even paint it on the side of your ship, as long as you did not fire a shot at your opponent. You had to, if you're carrying a Norwegian flag on that mast, you had to lower it, raise your flag, and then signal your intentions, who you were and what you intended to do. And if the other ship as much as pointed a gun at you, a handgun, that was an act of war, and they could open up on you. So the Germans took, a brand new ship and put a bunch of guns on it and named it the Mova. And the Mova was actually designed specifically to haul bananas from the Cameroons to Germany. So it's a banana boat that's been converted into a raider. Now, how these raiders worked, they traveled alone. They could fly Allied or neutral country flags. They would have false names or registry painted on the ship. They changed the paint scheme. These ships would have thousands of gallons of paint. So if someone radioed ahead, there's a strange ship that's got a blue funnel and a black hull, they could actually change the paint scheme of the ship. They'd even have false funnels. So if they said the ship had 2 funnels, they could suddenly add 3, and it even would belch smoke. And one ship that even had a guy dressed up as a woman pushing a baby stroller. So if you're sailing along and you see a ship coming toward you that looks a little suspicious, and you get the binoculars out, and there's a woman pushing a baby stroller, no German warship's going to have a woman with a baby stroller on board. So they want to delay your suspicion long enough that it's just too late. There's a point where it's just too late. They'd also issue false radio traffic back to Germany saying that we're over here when actually they're 600 miles to the west. So it was very hard to capture these ships. In fact, one ship that never got caught had 54 Allied ships trying to find it for half of the war. And those 54 ships could have been doing other useful things towards the war effort than chasing after a single ship. And the Mova did very well. She captured dozens and dozens of ships. In fact, the Mova was the most successful surface warship of all time. There's a couple submarines that had a better kill rate, but for a surface warship, this is the most successful warship of all time. How they captured their victims, they would just travel in shipping lanes. They'd have the crew hidden at battle stations ready for action. Once they were within range, they would lower the neutral flag and raise the German flag. They'd also sometimes behavior being casual. They'd actually have the guy kind of like he's falling asleep at the wheel. So the ship would not be straight on line. It would be kind of wallowing around in the water like the guy's nodding off at the wheel. What they would then do is lower the steel plates. The guns would swing out. They would jam any radio transmissions you might have for help. If you refused to stop, well, they'd also fire blank rounds. Not only to show that they had guns, but they had guns that could shoot live rounds. And they'd even put rounds into the bridge or the radio room if need be. And if you fought back, then there would be a battle. Now, they don't want to have a battle with you because they're in a thinly armed ship as well. The hull is very thin. So it's in their best interest to capture you without a shot being fired. But if shots were fired, then they'd have to defend themselves. Once you were taken prisoner, they would have another ship they'd captured over the horizon that they'd use as a POW ship. And once it was full, it would go back to Germany, be converted into another surface raider, and then that ship would go back out and do more damage. And the beauty of all this, if a ship, a true military ship goes on a tour, it can go out for maybe a month or two. These ships could go out for over 6 months. If they run out of coal, they would take it off your ship. If they had any need for food or typewriter ribbon or whatever they needed, they would just take it off your ship and then plant demolition charges and sink your ship on their way to the next victim. So these are models of the best, actually the most successful warships Germany had in World War I. And you can see they don't look anything like a destroyer or a light cruiser or a battleship. They're just freighter ships. And these things actually did very, very well. For the MOVA, she had guns that were there, and there was guns behind steel plates here. There were torpedo tubes there, and the emergency steering gear on the back was also a gun. The ship also carried a lot of mines. As she was on her way to her place to do her operations, she would be dropping mines out the back, and they actually sank a bunch of ships as well. You can see 14 knots, that's about 15 miles an hour. It's not a very fast ship, but the victims that she's after don't go much faster either. So it's the perfect ship to capture other transport ships. So she was captained by this man, Dinosaur. He was a very good captain, but as we'll see, he was prone to bragging about his exploits, and he tended to exaggerate some of these stories about his career. And actually, by the end of the war, he was persona non grata by most of the officers in the German Navy. Why? I mean, he was successful, but yeah, at their expense. They couldn't go out and do battle with the British. They were all blockaded in their ports. They'd been sunk, and here was this guy in a banana boat sinking ships right and left. So he was unpopular with his peers, but he felt very highly of himself. And he wrote a number of books during the interwar years, which were translated into 5 languages, about his crew's exploits. So the sinking of the Mount Temple, his account is that he had men on the bridge wings with high-powered binoculars looking for signs of smoke or mass on the horizon. They saw a puff of smoke. They sped as fast as they could to that spot. They got there. They couldn't see anything. They were about to give up, and then someone spotted 2 masts close together on the horizon, not far apart, but close together. So they knew that that ship was either coming toward them or going away. And as it turned out, it was coming toward them. So the gun crews got ready. The Mount Temple just kept coming toward them. They signaled who they were. They lowered the British flag. They raised the German flag. And the Mount Temple did nothing. And then suddenly the Mountain Temple realized what was going on, and a crew ran out and manned her gun, which was on the stern. There was guns put on the stern to fight the submarines that were still out there. And they apparently loaded a shell, aimed it at the German ship, and that was an act of war. And the German ship opened up on the Mount Temple, killing about 4 of her crew. Now, the German captain says that his gunnery of his crew was excellent, and they hit the gun on the Mount Temple, killing and wounding and dispersing the crew there. But when you look at the people who died, like the purser and a guy who was in the engine room and a guy who took care of horses that were on that ship, they were killed or badly wounded. They weren't the gun crew. So I think that was a bunch of hooey. He also talks about how the crew was in a panic and they broke into the captain's room and drank his whiskey, and then jumped in the lifeboats and improperly lowered them. And one of them, the rope went too far on one side too fast, and all the crew fell out into the water, and the ship was sailing in circles in a panic. And we'll see this all did a lot of hooey. So here's the Mount Temple captured. Now these are really bad photographs, and I think the reason why is that these are stills from a movie film. We know there was a film crew on board, so somewhere, I haven't been able to find it, there's motion picture footage of the Mount Temple being sunk. But you can see the gun swung out, the Mount Temple's there, and you can see all the lifeboats are still in their davits. There's no lifeboats, hanging by a thread or, people rowing away in a panic. He also talks about the accurate gunnery fire on the gun of the Mount Temple. These are not pictures of the Mount Temple, but this is just to show you what happens when a shell from a ship hits another ship. It explodes and sprays shrapnel everywhere. So you can see the funnel on the ship on the right has just been turned into a sieve. And this is probably how people that were not part of a gun crew were killed or wounded. The spray of the shrapnel just goes everywhere and can injure or kill a lot of people. Here's another picture of the Mount Temple stopped, and you can see all the lifeboats are still in their davits. So this tells me the Mount Temple was basically caught with her pants down, which is exactly what the Germans want to have happen. And here's the gun that the Mount Temple was supposed to defend herself with on the stern. And you might as well just have a little kid on the stern with a cap gun. Caliber for caliber, the MOVA had 9 times more guns, bigger guns than the Mount Temple did. So the Mount Temple did not have a chance. So as I said, there's propaganda footage. Of course, during a war, people are trying to do propaganda to keep your spirit of your civilians up and to make the spirit of your enemies' civilians decline. So they actually had a film crew on board. After the first tour of the MOVA did so well, they put on a film crew, and we know the film crew was there. This is a picture taken just days before the Mount Temple was sunk, and there's a camera right there. So we know somewhere is film, but we just haven't found it yet. So these are a list of the victims on her first tour. You can see there's a battleship. The MOVA actually sank a battleship with one of her mines, the flagship of the Atlantic Fleet of the Royal Navy. The unidentified French fishing vessels, there was so little of them left, they ran onto a mine. All they could tell is that they used to be a fishing vessel, so they were just blown to smithereens. And here's the second tour, all the ships that she captured and or sank. And then she also had another tour where she also caused mayhem in the Baltic. A medal was struck relating to all of this. So you've got the British represented by the sea lions, and the sea lions have a chain linking them together, and that chain symbolizes the blockade of German ports, how the Germans could not escape. But the MOVA, meaning seagull, flies overhead with impunity to go do her evil in the North Atlantic. This story repeats itself in World War II as well. The Germans again made surface raiders. The Italians and Japanese also experimented with them, but they were really ruthless. There was at least some chivalry in World War I. not in World War II. The captain of one of these ships in World War II would actually find a victim and then wait till it was nighttime and sneak up alongside and just blast it without any warning whatsoever. And he ended up going to prison for like 25 years in a war trial. And a movie was made about this. I haven't seen this. I'll have to try to find it someday. So a lot of people ask, what happened to the MOVA? And it's a very, very interesting story, which we'll relate here. So she survived World War I, but under war reparations, any ship over 5,000 tons had to be surrendered back to the British. So the MOVA was given to England, and she was named the Greenbrier and converted back into a banana hauler. And she hauled bananas from about 1920 to 1933. Then she was sold back to Germany and renamed the Oldenburg, and was basically an aging transport ship plying the North Sea. But when World War II broke out, the Oldenburg, ex-MOVA, was again doing military duty, not as a surface raider, just as a transport ship in support of the German occupation of Norway. So here comes the Norway connection again. People ask about the color pattern. It's to confuse a submarine as to the length of the ship and the speed of the ship. This big sweep on the side is supposed to look like a wake coming off of the bow to give you a false impression that the ship is going fast. So if you don't know the length of the ship or its speed, your chance of the torpedoes hitting are reduced. So she is armed with anti-aircraft guns, but she had a relatively quiet life during World War II, except in 1945. So now we have to go back to Norway to a place called Vadheim. Now it turns out that those two guys, Tom and Nikolai, were born and raised just 100 kilometers away from Vadheim. So a lot of small 6 degrees of separation stuff going on here. So years ago I gave a talk and I ended up on CBC radio, and a diver in Wainwright, of all places, called me up and says, let's go to Norway and dive on your ship. So we went there in 2005. Now, we know exactly what happened to the Oldenburg in 45. We've got declassified military accounts in German and in English explaining what happened. Now, in World War I, ships were immune from air attack. This is only one documented air attack, which we see illustrated here, of a plane attacking a ship. The planes were small and spindly. They couldn't fly very far. They were slow, and they couldn't carry a lot of weight in the way of bombs. But all that changes with World War II. There's huge technical advances in aircraft design and motors. Planes that went 100 miles an hour in World War I are now doing 450 miles an hour in World War II. So huge change in technology. And the British developed a plane called the Bristol Beaufighter, which one of its jobs was anti-shipping. So there's a plane there in the lower right, or lower left, and the plane would carry 4 20-millimeter cannon here, which would spew out in a second like 30 or 40 rounds. And it would also carry rockets. Now, these rockets they don't explode on contact, but they make a little hole going in and a huge hole going out. And what they want to do is fire the rockets at the waterline of the ship. And the ship is not sunk by explosions, it's sunk by flooding. And a broadside of these rockets was the equivalent of a light cruiser going off, one broadside. You can see they fly really close to the water level. So it's very dangerous work. And these are some gun camera footage pictures of these Bristol Beaufighters attacking German shipping at wave top level. You can see it's like kicking over a hornet's nest. You've got planes flying from all different directions, shooting at you. You can see these little brightly colored dots. These are the tail ends of the rockets on their way to the ship, which is hidden by spray of smoke from the anti-aircraft guns and spray from these splashes. These are the 20-millimeter cannon splashes. What they do is they fire in the water and then raise or lower the tail of the plane till the shells are striking at the water line, and then they fire off the rockets. And when you're caught out on the open sea like this, you can't escape. This ship here, the story goes that it was apparently a pleasure tour by a bunch of high-ranking Gestapo agents. So it got some extra treatment. And here's an amazing shot. You can just see the plane's literally flying through its own spray as it shoots its cannon at the ship. You can see shells ricocheting off the ship as well. And you got these vertical walls, because these ships are all being attacked in Norway, where there's a lot of fjords with very steep sides. So because Germany was losing all of her ships toward the end of the war, what they did is they'd sail at night and pull into a fjord and hide there during the day, and hopefully they'd be immune from air attack, which, as it turns out, didn't happen. So here we have the Oldenburg in the lower foreground here. I don't know why a German soldier felt compelled to climb up a hill and take a picture, but he did, and because of that we have before and after pictures of the attack. So he took a picture, the ship is sitting idly here, and just to show you the steepness of the fjords, it's very hard to fly around in a space that tight. So what they have to do is come over the mountains and then down alongside the ship and attack that way. So here's a camera photo of the Oldenburg in the harbor. And when we went there in 2005, we were able to actually park ourselves right on top of where the ship used to be. So here's the view that the Germans had in 45. We also interviewed a lot of senior citizens in the town who told us the stories of their experience as children and young adults on that day. And they said that basically a single plane flew over in the morning, and they all went to battle stations and nothing happened. And they were all sitting around doing nothing. And then all of a sudden, a whole bunch of planes just came right through this notch. And so you can imagine just sitting right here with the planes just diving right down at you, firing their guns and rockets. And the people said, because of the fjord, you know, if you fire a gun in a fjord, it will echo back and forth. They said for 15 to 20 minutes, it was just noise. Like no pause, just combining the shooting of anti-aircraft guns from the ships and the ground, the planes' motors, the planes' machine guns, all that. It was just this, just noise, just a roar for a total of 15 to 20 minutes. So here's some gun camera footage of the rockets streaking down towards the Oldenburg. You can see they're flying right over top of the mountain there. Streaking down even closer. And here you can see close-ups. The Oldenburg looks like it's on fire, but this is just smoke from her anti-aircraft guns covering the ship. You can see splashes where some of the rockets are missing. And as the last plane left the harbor, they thought they'd failed. They thought they'd failed in their mission. But if you take the same photograph and zoom in on it, you can see a plume of smoke coming up right there. And what they did is they did, in fact, hit the ship in a number of vital places. And what we're seeing here is steam, probably from her engine room, belching out the sides. And the Oldenburg rolled onto her side. Well, here's, yeah, so I was able to go back to the spot where the guy took the photo. There's a bit of change of the ground. They'd been doing some construction or moving the earth around. So we can see the scene in 45 and the scene in 2005. So the blue house is still there. It's got a bigger roof on it now. But basically, it hasn't changed. And you can see the dinghy there with the dive crew on board. So she lays on her side and is in very good condition. The dive guys I was with, they said on a scale of 10, this is a 10. It's in perfect condition. You can see the wartime photographs and the same part of the ship today. Where I'm going with the project in the future, I'm still conducting research on the 1916 field season, working towards getting more information on the individual ship histories. A couple years ago, I met the great-grandson of the captain of the Mount Temple and got a lot of information from him. We went to see the captain's gravesite, and I was able to actually see an architectural model of the Mount Temple. People have said, well, in a perfect world, where would you like to go further with this? And I'd actually like to go back and try to find the Mount Temple and maybe salvage the fossils if found. I want to go back to Norway and get more film footage there as well. And lectures and books and all that kind of stuff. So people say, well, can you even dive for fossils underwater? And the answer is yes. People dive in Florida all the time for shark teeth and other Pleistocene-age mammal material. People dive for dinosaur bones in the Adriatic and in the English Channel as well. So it is possible, but that's in shallow water. The Mount Temple is not in shallow water. She's in 14,440 feet of water. It's a lot. She's deeper than Titanic, but not as deep as Bismarck. So the technology does exist to go look for the Mount Temple. She weighed about 10,000 tons of steel. So with a towed or an autonomous magnetometer, that would be a big metal target on the bottom. Where is she? Now, insurance papers give a very vague 620 miles west of Fastnet, which is a lighthouse, and half south. That's not very good information, but the German war book, the German warship's logbook, gives the coordinates, very good coordinates. And that puts her right on the western flank of the mid-Atlantic ridge, 14,440 feet of water. Of course, it would be very difficult logistically to get to as well. The nearest piece of land is the westernmost Azores, 550 miles to the southeast. Could we find it? It's possible. Using the German warship's logbook coordinates and our knowledge of the speed and direction of the ocean currents there, if the ship was stopped and the crew taken off and then the demolition charges were planted, that would all have to happen as quickly as possible. The German surface raider does not want another ship to come over the horizon, see what's going on, and tell the rest of the world there's a surface raider here. So it's in the best interest of the Germans to get the sinking of the ship done quickly as possible. So if we give them an hour, or let's say 2 hours, if we use those coordinates as a starting point, I would think the ship would be maybe as far as a baby can crawl in 2 hours to the northeast. Could they even be there, the fossils? The answer is yes. They find coal, which is the fossil from the Titanic. They've got wood planks. They've got food in jars on Titanic. They've got paper goods. All of these items, I think you would agree, are a lot less durable than a dinosaur bone. Leather goods, bristles on brushes, again, a lot less durable than dinosaur bones. Even a shirt with the guy's name written on the inside of the collar survived. Unfortunately, the guy who wore it did not. It is possible to bring heavy items up from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean from great depth. This is the iron bits where you'd tie the ropes on when you're in dock. They were able to bring that piece of iron up 3 tons in weight. So it's all possible to do. If you want to know more information, we have a Mount Temple website, which has a number of papers I've written by myself and with others on there as PDFs if you want to download them and read, and a lot of other information on our trips to Norway, etc. I'd like to thank all these people. This is not a project one can do just by yourself. It's a lot of people involved, and most of these people I know quite well, but when I talk to the people overseas, they get right on board. They all know about the Mount Temple sinking, but they did not know about the dinosaur connection. So suddenly they want to get involved. So these people have been very helpful to me as well. And with that, I thank you, and I'll entertain any questions you may have.